Be the hero at home when you order Carrabba's Italian Grill with delivery or carside carryout located in the shops at Cumberland. Feed up to 5 starting at $7 per person with Carrabba's family bundles. Delivery begins after 4 p.m. and curbside takeaways available for lunch and dinner. Order online at carrabbas.com/delivery and get made from scratch Italian tonight.
Welcome to the Race Haven Radio Show and Podcast, your source for solutions-focused dialogue about race in America, with your host, Scott Speed.
Hello and welcome to the Race Haven Podcast. This is solutions-focused dialogue about race relations in America. My name is Dr. Scott Speed, and I am the facilitator of the dialogue. This is episode 18 of Race Haven, and today I am joined by my co-host and friend, John Costino. John, how are you doing today, my friend?
I'm doing great, Scott. How about yourself?
I am doing excellent. John, I'm really excited today because today we have a special guest, Dr. Walter Greason. And I want to tell you and our listeners a little bit more about Dr. Greason before we bring him on and introduce him to our listeners. Dr. Walter Greason is the CEO of the International Center for Metropolitan Growth. He has taught at hundreds of colleges and universities across the United States since 1997 and is currently teaching business and economic development at Monmouth University. Dr. Greason's research interests include African and American history, emphasizing the relationship between poverty and economic development. His interests also include the transatlantic slave trade, innovation in experiential education, and the intellectual legacy of white supremacy. For the last 20 years, he has established himself as the world's leading authority on the economics of race and metropolitan growth, serving the world's most prosperous metropolitan region, the Boston to Washington, D.C. corridor. Dr. Greason has advised hundreds of businesses and organizations on fiscal management, investment, and development strategies. He also currently serves as the treasurer of the Society for American City and Regional Planning History and is an officer on the membership committee of the Organization of American Historians. Recently, Dr. Greason won recognition as a visiting scholar at James Madison University in Virginia, and his next book, Suburban Erasure, will be available really soon. So let's say hello to Dr. Greason. Let me get him on here. Dr. Greason, how are you doing today?
Morning, Scott. How you feel?
I am doing great, and I'm also joined by my co-host, John.
Hi, John.
Good morning. Good morning, sir. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Dr. Greason, we're so honored to have you this morning and that you've carved out some time to share your vast knowledge base and history with us. And I want to share with our listeners today how we first met. I want to say that I met you through the Race Haven Community Dialogue page when you became a member there. And I want to ask you, because I do not know, we actually spoke briefly last week for the first time by phone, but we've interacted through the Race Haven page. And I want to know, how did you learn about the Race Haven Community Dialogue page on Facebook?
Yeah, so I think I've been a member there probably almost 2 years. And so social media, digital humanities work has been a part of my career for a very long time, before I was even a professional historian. And so my computer design background drew me to Facebook generally in 2007. But then when it really exploded and started to expand around 2010, 2011, I started using a lot of the different group pages and the interactive forums that had emerged there to spread the word about the questions we weren't asking. And so Race Haven came to me specifically through a Philadelphia poet named Shalita Hale, who actually I had encountered her not through Facebook initially, but back in the day through MySpace. So you're going back in the digital archive, going through Facebook there. And so she had done a poetry event for me in Pennsylvania celebrating Dr. King, I want to say around 2008. And then when the Race Haven Forum became part of what she was doing, she made the suggestion to me. She's like, oh, this is a great group of people. They could really benefit from the work that you're doing. Come here and join the conversation. And so that's how I came to be a part of Race Haven.
Wow, I love it. I love the 6 degrees of separation and how the world works, and how you end up meeting the people you're supposed to meet. Because Shalita and I, we used to work together when I still lived in the Philadelphia area some years ago, and she became a member of that group, and she's someone that I value. Her friendship is one that I value, and I'm so glad that she introduced you to the Race Haven Forum. And with that being said, I appreciate you giving us that background. So I want to share with our listeners that today we're going to dialogue with Dr. Greason about his work and his research and how it impacts race relations in America. But before we start the interview/dialogue, I'd like to tell our listeners about how they can become patrons of the show. My goal is to have an entirely user-supported show free of advertisements. So I created a Patreon page recently, which is an online platform where our listeners can earn cool perks like a custom Race Haven t-shirt by supporting the ongoing improvement in quality of the show for as little as $1 a month. So please visit RaceHavenPodcast.com and click Become a Patron to see all of the details. I'd like to thank our most recent patrons, Jake Tate Malone. I want to say thank you so much for believing in the work that we're doing here with Race Haven. And I also want to thank an anonymous donor. We have an anonymous donor who contributed a brand new microphone to me to record these shows. So today I am recording for the first time on a brand new microphone that should enhance the sound quality and clarity of my voice during these podcasts. So it is really, really cool. It looks like I have a little studio in my house. I'm going to take a picture and post it on our Facebook group page because this is really cool. I never envisioned doing this. So it's just interesting how all this evolves. And now I have a microphone with the handle and the whole setup here right in my home office. So it's so cool. So I want to thank that anonymous donor and, just anyone who's chosen to contribute and become a patron to this point. It's been about 2 weeks since we started, since we launched the page. And I just can't express how much it makes, how good it makes me feel to know that people value this work and they feel like we're adding value to their lives and most importantly to society. It just means so much to me because when I started this process 2 years ago, I just wanted to try to make a difference. And it's the little things like, the contributions and not even the contributions, not only the contributions, but also, the comments, the likes, and just you listening, the listens to this show. All those things validate that it was worth it. It was worth, endeavoring on this journey. So I want to thank all of you, our listeners, and all of our patrons. Thank you so much. So with that being said, our listeners are used to John and I dialoguing since we started this new format with John joining me as a co-host officially. And today, this is our first co-interview. So I'm excited about that, where John and I are both going to have a chance to interview Dr. Greason. So Dr. Greason, to start the show, because this is a show based on race relations in America, I want to start by you sharing with our listeners, just to add some, what is your ethnicity and where did you grow up?
All right. I self-identify as African-American, but I had an extraordinarily kind of unusual, diverse upbringing in New Jersey in the late 70s and early 80s. So I grew up in a segregated suburb, a place called Freehold, New Jersey, and then later a very rural African-American migrant community in a larger township called Manalapan. And so if you take a look at suburban erasure, that's really what drew me to that subject of research, was growing up in the area. My family had some health issues at the time I was finishing my PhD, and so I had to tell the story of what was happening to the people who made my life possible, but also place it in global economic context, that how were black farming communities being destroyed by residential and commercial suburbanization through the 80s and 90s. And what was being lost, how a forgotten chapter of the civil rights movement was literally being erased from the landscape through that process. And so I'm African-American, but I also grew up in a school that had a lot of folks from Italy, from Israel, from Syria, Lebanon, from Japan and Korea and the Philippines. And so the school that I attended from when I was, 4 or 5 years old until I graduated from high school, I was the only African American in my grade for all but 2 years. And the school had about 600 people, and there were never more than 7 or 8 African Americans in the entire school at the time. So that was a profound impact on me to kind of get introduced to the standard of what people considered American civilization, what folks in the 19th century called Anglo-Saxonism. My school was permeated with those ideas and assumptions, and then having to live through that and adapt and grow into it, while at the same time being deeply steeped 4 or 5 days a week in both the Baptist and Methodist traditions in the black community. That combination has proven to shape my entire life of how do you build a bridge between people with wildly different cultural expectations and backgrounds.
Interesting. You actually, got into my next question, which was, how did your upbringing impact your views on race in America? And I think you just answered that, and how that intersection of the various cultures and being steeped in the European Anglo-Saxon values that the country was built on, you were introduced to those at a very young age based on your surroundings, and ultimately brought you to a place where it sounds like I'm hearing you say that based on your background as an African American, being raised up in that family environment and church environment and community environment, but then going to a school and seeing various ethnicities and getting introduced to the I guess American norms of society. I want to focus on that, what you said in terms of wanting to build a bridge. Can you elaborate on that a little bit and why you chose that language in terms of deciding that you wanted to use your experiences to build a bridge?
Yeah, so in a sense, I guess there's several ways to speak to that. I could take up, multiple hours on that topic. But to do it quickly, the school environment I was in had no idea. They couldn't imagine the kinds of daily life routines my family and neighbors experienced. It was unimaginable to them. These were generally fairly affluent families. They could afford to pay, at least on average $8,000 to $9,000 a year above whatever everybody else paid for public education to send them to this private academy. And they had no sense, none at all, of any degree of African American culture. And at the same time, the kind of Anglo-Saxonism they were being exposed to was meant to help them assimilate as people who were not British or of Northern Europe. This was a way for them, now that they had achieved some degree of wealth, to begin to climb a very elite ladder and compete to kind of get access to the Harvards and Yales and Princetons of the world. It was a way for first-generation American parents to really help their children, the grandchildren of immigrants, become part of the American elite. That was really what the school was designed to do. The only, child of African-American farm workers in the school, they just had no concept of the world that I came from. So building the bridge in that sense was not just from the kind of rural black experience in the North, which is weird in its own context, but then not just to kind of elite New England Anglo-Saxonism, but to a group of immigrants trying to join that elite. And so I was constantly negotiating how people were making choices to improve their lives, not just in a material sense, but to feel like their character and their values were improving. And then I was exposed to a great professor named Oti Numalo from South Africa, who he was living in exile under apartheid in 1990. And he showed me the global context of that same struggle. And so I went on from there to Villanova University, which was a kind of elite Catholic institution based in serving a really regional population from Long Island and New Jersey, perhaps a little bit out of Maryland, and globalizing that as an institution, helping them see that the university itself could be a platform to bring people to a larger world and help them be fuller, more capable, more determined human beings. And so my whole life has been built around tearing down barriers of segregation and inequality from my earliest days of imagining. I'd say I really dedicated my life to that mission by the time I was 16 or 17 years old, and it's been every day ever since.
Interesting. I want to let John jump in here because I'm sure your story is resonating with him a little bit, because John is also from New Jersey, and he went to a Catholic university in Philadelphia, or St. Joseph's University, which is
rival.
A rival in with Villanova, and I'm from that area as well. I grew up right near City Line Avenue in Winfield, in West Philly and Winfield. So I'm from that area as well. So we definitely have all crossed paths or walked the same streets at some point. So John, do you have any questions or anything for Dr. Greason at this time?
At this point, honestly, Dr. Greason, I'm enjoying hearing your perspective because, as Scott mentioned, I did grow up in the same area and have almost the same type of experience. I grew up in very South Jersey in Voorhees, right outside of Philadelphia, about the same time. So I was in grammar school in the late 70s and early 80s as well, and completely resonate with the perspective that you're bringing in that in the suburbs I grew up in, it was relatively European American, and more to the point, all the Philadelphia athletes lived in that suburban area. Mm-hmm. So the kids that I grew up with were the children of Philadelphia Eagles, Philadelphia Sixers, Philadelphia Phillies. So as you can imagine, for me it was a different environment, and as I've shared on the podcast many times, I did not grow up in the middle of, the traditional aspect of racism. We didn't see it that way, and so I'm thoroughly enjoying listening to you. So honestly, thank you for being here, and I'm going to kick it back over to you, Scott, because I really don't have any questions at this point, but I'm enjoying more than hopefully as much as the listeners hearing this.
Thanks, John. I'd love to talk with you more about that experience growing up there. I'm fascinated.
Absolutely.
So I'd like to ask you at this time, Dr. Greason, what attracted you to becoming a historian, and not just a historian, but you have an interesting background as a historian and an economist. So if you could speak to what attracted you to becoming a historian and a researcher on the economics of race and ethnicity in America, but also globally. I know that you study it globally. So if you can kind of speak to that, that would be great.
No problem. So I guess the shortest way to answer that, I've always been fascinated, like I said, with social change. And I think I had to come to grips with the social and cultural ways and the legal ways that different forms of racism and segregation evolved. And so I spent, most of my late teenage years and early 20s understanding that. When I started my doctoral process, it was at Temple University, and their strength in that particular PhD program was dealing with urbanization, dealing with how cities form. And so I spent 5 years before my dissertation studying and teaching about industrialization and urban growth. And it was fascinating. I learned so much about the ways that large factory cultures and different kinds of industries emerged in different places, the way that labor unions impacted the way the politics operated through the first half of the 20th century. And so it was a lot of fascinating stories in doing that work at Temple. When I began to work on doing really the only study of suburbanization in the context of eliminating a northern civil rights struggle project, helped me take the tradition of looking at civil rights in urban context and then broadening it to look at suburbs. As I looked at the process of how suburbs were formed, I had to learn a great deal about real estate finance. And that was not a part of the core graduate program at Temple. That was largely self-taught for me to figure out how large developers like the Toll Brothers or K. Hovnanian engaged in the process of borrowing from banks through taking advantage of loan programs that are guaranteed either through Congress or through the Federal Reserve, and then figuring out how the economies of scale enabled those real estate companies to utterly transform the landscape of rural areas, not just in New Jersey, but across the country. And so when I began to understand that the world that I grew up in, where someone who made $80,000, $100,000 was upper middle class to borderline affluent or wealthy, that these folks were rapidly going to be left behind as the 21st century started. That, in fact, if you weren't in a world where you understood how to make $150,000, $200,000, $250,000 a year, you would be essentially consigned to poverty to one degree or another. And so this is what I was discovering by about 2001, 2002. And so I started to teach a course called Engines of Wealth that combined urban history with this really more forward-looking financial analysis of the way the American national economy had evolved and the way the world economy was going to continue to evolve. And so that's been my work for, I've been working to publish Suburban Erasure, and thank God it was published in 2013 and won a number of awards, and it's done very well in the last 3 years. But this past January, I published The American Economy, which was the first hint of what I've been studying since 2002, in the ways that a free market, free enterprise system was born in the United States in the 1770s and 1780s, and how those assumptions from the 18th century have continued to inform and shape the way both law governs commerce and the way kind of the unconscious choices of what we think is possible are still rooted in the late 18th and early 19th century. And so now I have a number of new books coming out over the next 2 or 3 years about the subject. I'm going to be looking at particularly defining globalization more accurately. I think one of the most promising features is that at the Davos conference in Europe this past summer, a major thesis of my work that GDP does not actually predictably measure the well-being of a national economy has now been adopted by some of the most prominent economists around the world. So I'm very excited at that my work on asset value, a different way to understand what prosperity means for not just a small segment of the population, but for humanity as a whole and for nations and their working people. That process is going to be the work of my next decade, that we can come up with a better system. And the most applied way that this takes off is that in understanding real estate finance, I came to see the way that different kinds of asset classes create intergenerational wealth that really eliminate poverty very rapidly. And so I've designed a system that helps folks, good number of folks who are in poverty in the U.S., earning less than $10,000 a year, can go to the place where they're more stable, not in any perfect shape, but they can earn $25,000, $30,000, $50,000 a year. And that makes a huge difference for a single wage earner dealing with, multiple dependents, whether they're elder care or small children. And so that's one big revolution. But the entire ladder that I created, this wealth praxis system, is a way to get everybody not just from poverty to stability, but to take folks who are middle class, household incomes at the $80,000 level, the $120,000 level, and get them to really grow out of the middle class, to take advantage of what had been promised for so long as an American dream. How do they get to the place where really passive income streams dominate their lives, and they have the flexibility not to have to work 60, 70 hours a week just to pay their bills for their entire life? And that's the system that I've now formally incorporated as my company, and I do a lot of that work as part of the private sector that goes along with my academic work to both bring large-scale investment to working neighborhoods, but also to help working people in segregated areas, low-income areas, understand how to make better choices so that they can take advantage of the way the global market is evolving around them.
Wow, that's very, very interesting. Can go a lot of different directions with this. So the last thing that you said was that how you're creating systems for, to drive passive income so that people can live the American dream, and that's the work with your company now. Is that company you're speaking of the International Center for Metropolitan Growth?
Yes, yeah.
Is that a for-profit company or a nonprofit company? And can you tell the listeners more about that company?
Yeah.
Or is there anything else you can share outside of what you've already shared?
No, absolutely. And I just, I do want to focus on the academic stuff too, so I'm careful not to go one direction or the other too much. But back in 96 actually, someone brought me a historical document and reminded me it was actually 96. I founded a nonprofit organization called the Ujima Collective. And this is based on one of the Swahili words out of Kwanzaa, is collective work and responsibility. And this is based in Philly. We published newsletters and websites for about 5 years. We served at its max, like in 2001, about 250,000 people, and set up programs to send young people from the Philadelphia area off to local schools with full scholarships, a program that's now been adopted by the city government and has been expanded dramatically. But Ujima was my and my partners, Louis Manning and Oscar Gamble's way of getting Philadelphia youth to take advantage of the opportunities, not just in education, but in the marketplace, to build events and to build cross-cultural coalitions through the universities, through their high schools and churches and neighborhoods. It would become a more cohesive city. And I think, as we see with this convention that's happening, there's some extraordinary engagement, both within the convention and in the streets as people protest. Philadelphia has become one of the most dynamic cities in the United States based on some of the principles we were working on now 20 years ago. I can't believe that. But Ujima, when I went in and got my first tenure-track job and I was working at a college, I converted it into a more for-profit structure to help fundraise for Africana Studies programs that didn't receive budgets from local universities. And when I actually pulled off a project in Phoenixville, PA, out in the suburbs, it's on the border, I guess, of Montgomery County. If you go out on Route 30, you'll run into Phoenixville. We helped them pull off a project that made about $50 million for the town. I was like, oh, we can do some really good work on a state level, on a national level, using the same kind of framework. So I converted the Ujima baseline kind of blueprint into a for-profit model to make it the International Center for Metropolitan Growth. And that was the way that we were both opening the door for folks to have a more stable household financially, but also to let folks know around the world, large-scale investors who would put in, $5 million, upwards of, $600 million into different projects. How do we actually take real institutional investment and place it where it's most needed? How do we get into places like Norristown? How do we get into places like Chester or Camden? And really, without having to kind of go through government grants and really rely on political connections, how can we get the private sector to move in a way that is socially just? And that's what the Center for Metropolitan Growth has been about, is that the dynamic that we've created is that the world market is much stronger than any even coalition, trade network of powerful national governments. Coming out of Brexit, for instance, just as an example, they're talking about, we're not going to pay $600 billion a year back into the Eurozone. Instead, we're going to leverage that money to create a trade network between Australia and the United States. Well, that's great for my company in particular, because about 2/3 of that money is going to come into efforts like my incubator to bring new investment and create new startups in the U.S. But the people that I work with who are in Newark or Jackson, Mississippi, or Oakland, community activists, even folks who do pretty impressive stuff with community development corporations and work through the Congressional Black Caucus offices, they don't tap into those large streams of capital that really enable folks like you with a show like this in Race Haven to hire staff and pull in 15 people and doing your marketing, doing your advertising, making sure you have the stream of money coming through to make your show really what it is. It's the future of radio. And that's the kind of thing I get to do pretty much every day, is whatever your particular passion and project is, I can find banks and insurance companies, potential advertisers, potential sponsors who want to come on board and basically transform the scale of the economy that you serve, how the market actually serves your mission. And so last week, for instance, very exciting stuff, project I've worked on for 6 years is the T. Thomas Fortune House in Red Bank, New Jersey. Fortune was a journalist, very much like you guys, and he exposed the horrors of lynching long before Ida Wells Barnett, before the rise of Booker T. Washington. He essentially helped create the idea of Booker T. Washington and the Tuskegee machine, and he was forgotten. He's been largely erased, and he lived in a local house here near where I teach. And so I worked with the folks on that committee, and we went through multiple cycles of trying to get fundraising and struggling to get the money together. But finally, local developers come on board and put up $2.5 million to rehab the property and make it a sustainable site to revitalize a very deteriorated, economically neglected area. And yes, he's going to make a profit off of it. It's a great effort for him to take on because it's going to do well. But more importantly, that seed money is going to turn into, over the next 10 years, $10 million, $12 million, $25 million in new jobs and new business creation and educational opportunities for a population that's never seen anything like that in the last 100 years. And so
wow.
That's the kind of project I take on, and I'm constantly working for as I travel around the country.
That's amazing, and I'm enjoying this insight, and we're gonna have to have some conversations offline, as I kind of hinted at before when we spoke on the phone, because I could go in so many directions based on some of the other projects I'm working on as well. But in terms of how this all deals with race and economics and how they collide, that's what's really fascinating, and that's why I wanted to do this show. And before I ask my follow-up question, I want to know if John has anything that he'd like to ask, or if he'd like to jump in, because just so you know, Dr. Greason, John is the CEO of a company called MoneyWise. So this is right up his alley. And, John and we're literally entrepreneurs calling to put together this show and to contribute to this message of dialoguing, interracial dialogue about the various race relation issues that we have in our country. But we're entrepreneurs first. So this conversation really is resonating with me, and I'm sure it's resonating with him as well. John, do you have anything you'd like to ask at this time?
It is nothing to ask, but again, I'm thoroughly enjoying this, and I appreciate more than anything, Dr. Greason, what you're talking about within communities. I've been for 30 years now a field representative, a consultant in the industry, and a corporate officer and owner in network marketing space. And I have spent my entire adult career trying to educate, folks from every demographic that if you truly believe in your business, and I had read your article about, staying within your social network, staying within your local community, supporting each other, supporting each other's businesses. What you're bringing is just such a refreshing perspective, and I'm excited. So I'm going to go ahead and kick it back over to you, because I'm thoroughly enjoying listening. I promise I'm not going to ask questions just to hear myself talk.
Oh, stop. It's wonderful to hear it. I'd love to hear.
Awesome. Well, absolutely, John. Definitely want to, if you feel like the need to jump in at any point, I'll keep, kicking it over to you just to get your perspective or your questions. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely.
So moving to my next question, Dr. Greason, what is the intellectual legacy of white supremacy, and what did you find during your research of this topic?
I don't get asked that question enough, and so it's one of the biggest things. It's why I talk very pointedly about Anglo-Saxonism. So I guess to frame it, when I graduated college and had a initial understanding of the evolution of racism as a concept, the basic outlines of white supremacy in the United States and world history, I was astonished at how little was taught about it before college. It helped me make sense of the way law and religion and science are designed. Like, these basic, huge concepts about how we see our world are all thoroughly infused with the concept of race, that they were all part of a process of justifying seeing people from Europe as white, that racializing of a geographic region into a color, and then tying that color to certain kinds of religious values and philosophical principles. The sense of scientific progress is all thoroughly shaped by this lie of saying those ideas are fundamentally a product of European genius, and that is a white experience, that is a white inheritance. And going back through historical documents, I'm still fighting with publishers to do an encyclopedia based on this topic, but you go back into the era between 1750 and 1850, and you see that people are making active choices to promote that propaganda. And then it works. By the middle of the 19th century, people have bought it. And it combines with the process of commercial market growth and industrialization to then become the standard of how we invent the modern world in the 20th century. My next major single-authored work, not an edited collection of documents, really goes into the details of that process. And so when I talk about the intellectual legacy of essentially white identity, white supremacy, it gets me away from a problem I saw coming out of college, that we understood racism as discrimination against especially black people, and just saying that as people of African descent are all racialized as black to a certain extent. And we even conflate and equate the ideas of being white and being black as the two sides of the same coin of racialization, which doesn't really work if you go into different linguistic backgrounds. You go into a Spanish language or a Portuguese language tradition, very different processes of racialization and how those ideas get adopted. And they have different consequences socially and legally and economically. But in the Anglo-Saxon tradition of creating whiteness and then as a corollary, diminishing, demeaning, making wretched blackness in the law and in science and in religion, that whole legacy going into the 20th century, we've never taken the time to unpack it. And so when we come across a kind of miraculous moment from 1948 to 1972, when the country really steps back and says, no, we don't want to keep people segregated by law. We don't want to argue that because of the color of your skin or the texture of your hair, you will be held as superior or inferior, and not just for your life, but for the lives of all of your children. When we try to take a step back from that, we never have a really dedicated, informed discussion about removing all those tangled legacies from the society we live in every day. The one that, of course, is most profound to me is the way that real estate financing is informed by this, that we, in the 1930s, 1936, 1937, created standards for evaluating property value that were intrinsically racialized, that said, okay, if you are from an Anglo-Saxon family or a Dutch family, a French or German family, your property is going to be evaluated at a higher level. You're going to get more money in terms of how you can enter the market and sell your property than if you are Jewish or if you're Italian or if you're Japanese or Chinese, and certainly than if you are Native American or African American. And so just that, we've done a really good job in the last 40, 50 years of identifying that process, and then we haven't stepped into how do you actually remove those influences. Like I've had students still do ethnographic collection where they go out and try to kind of negotiate for houses, and depending on their physical appearance, shown different properties, they're told different prices for what the property is available for. We're still in our day-to-day practice of negotiating with each other, read racial and ethnic meaning onto people that has dramatic economic consequences for their lives. And so that's also true in science. There are all kinds of ways that the way we apply the scientific method is deeply troubling. That you can see things, I guess, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks is one of these most recent studies that documents this, that if you don't know that story, it's an African-American woman in the 30s whose cells are taken, and it finds out that she has a kind of unique genetic marker that lets her cells adapt to different kinds of stimulus as she's infected, as the cells are infected with different viruses or bacteria. And it leads to pioneering breakthroughs for 50 years in the ways that we deal with cancer. Billions and billions of dollars in cancer treatments derived from this woman's biological matter, but her family was never notified. She was never told about the value of the material that was taken from her. And so there's this enormous problem about using people who are seen as lesser than or inferior for economic gain and never actually including them in the process of how the structure of a free market works and evolves. And that leads to all the stuff that we're seeing with Black Lives Matter, the kind of resentment that there's no value lives of people of African descent, not just in the U.S. but around the world. And so the structure of how we think and how we choose the world that we want to build, we need to step back and really take apart the way that we've kind of decided who has value and who doesn't, and how does that play out in every way that we make choices that look like they're colorblind, that look like, in fact, they're somehow race neutral. And so that's a very difficult process. It might take 100 years, 200 years. It took 100 years for that system to take root. So that's the kind of problem I'm talking about with the intellectual legacy of white supremacy.
Man, that resonates with me on so many levels because, you know, I spend time and I know we're Facebook friends. I'm not sure what you see that comes across my timeline, but every once in a while I go into the lab and I write a long blog post about just various historical markers that prove how we got to the point that we are at today. And I met with a lady recently, an older woman of European descent, and we were talking about, you know, the current police relations and race relations, and she made the statement that I don't know how it got this bad. And because I just didn't feel like going into a long, detailed conversation at that moment, I just kind of let it go. But in my mind, I'm thinking that's the problem.
Yep.
That sentiment right there is the problem, because most people don't know how it got that bad, how things have gotten this bad, in the sense that for me, it's like anything. Everything compounds. It's kind of the way I say it all the time. Everything compounds. The same way that you can pass down generational wealth, and you can see how companies have, you know, their growth has compounded over time based on, or investments, how they compound, or residual income, how it constantly, you know, it can mature and grow and passively, you know, move. So do all the things of the legacy. I guess the best way to say it, the legacy of white supremacy does the same. And the people who have been oppressed by white supremacy, those residual, you know, markers or effects have also compounded, and you continue to see it. So when people talk about things like the crime and the murders and poor African-American communities, et cetera, it really hurts my mind and it hurts my heart that people can't connect the dots to the history and the legacy of what this country is and what it was. So it's all very complex and it's all very hard, but it's interesting because immediately when, you know, whenever I see the words white supremacy or, you know, I read that in my mind, and John can help me out with this, I automatically think that the average European American person who's not necessarily taking the time to go back and study history, they immediately think KKK when they hear white supremacy. But they don't unpack it any more than that. They don't understand it any more than that. And that in itself is a legacy of white supremacy. That lack of knowledge and that lack of understanding of the depths of the history of what white supremacy was is a part of the legacy of white supremacy. So, John, I just want you to, if you can give me some perspective and give our listeners some perspective on that, John, when you read the words, the intellectual legacy of white supremacy, just on the surface, what does that mean to you? Could you add some context?
Absolutely, and we've discussed this many times. For me, and again, at this stage, obviously, I'm much more aware because of our dialogues and because of, you know, a lot of the information I've learned over the past few months on the show. But going back to how it used to hit me, it was a shocking word. It's a word that, for me personally, because I don't have that history, I don't have that awareness, and I don't, as you know, Scott, I've just never resonated with the racist prejudice, you know, bigotry that, you know, so many people, I guess it's a part of their DNA, it's a part of their life. I've just kept myself away from people like that. So when I hear terms like white supremacist or white privilege, and as we discussed in previous episodes, black power, it causes me that knee-jerk reaction or that little choking feeling like, do I really want to talk to this person, or do I really hear what they're going to say? Because it connotates for me a very negative aspect of our history. Is that a fair enough way to put that in perspective?
Absolutely, John. And that's not even, and I like Dr. Greason to speak to this, because from you and other friends, literally, I just had another friend who responded to a post on Facebook that just said, I don't want to talk about race. If you're my friend, you're my friend, but I don't want to talk about race. And I haven't responded yet because it's in response to this meme I put up that basically said that, if you say you have, the meme says black friends. You say you have black friends, but if you've never spoken to your quote unquote black friends about how race, impacts their lives and how, race in America, et cetera, has impacted their lives, then you don't really have black friends. You just know some black people. Now, obviously, most memes are intended to be inflammatory, but I shared that, and it definitely did spark some dialogue, which is a good thing in my mind, where I was able to kind of clarify. But one of these friends who I've never spoken about race to, just chimed in and said that, for him, he doesn't want to talk about race. And he's a great guy. Our kids have gone to each other's birthday parties, and, he's a European American, and our kids have gone to each other's birthday parties, and we've hung out, et cetera. But we've never talked about race. And he chimed in to say that, he just doesn't want to. And that doesn't make him a bad person. But I believe that a part of the legacy of white supremacy has put us in that place where when you hear it just as a neutral person, someone who feels like, I'm quote unquote colorblind, it makes you feel, it kind of brings up all the negative connotations with what that means. But that's also a barrier to us kind of learning and the nuance and the complexity and unpacking, how all those things continue to impact us today, because so many people are apathetic to it because they don't want to touch it because there's so much, just negativity wrapped up in it. It also prevents us from going, to the depths that we need to go to really bring about true harmony. So does that make sense? What I
Scott,
just
can I
said,
speak
Dr.
to that
Greason?
real fast?
Sure.
Can I speak to that real fast? Only because I saw that meme that you put up, and this is what it sparked in my mind. And I say this with complete respect, as you know. We did a show a few weeks ago when we discussed Jesse Williams' speech at the BET Awards. Mm-hmm. And to me, it goes right back to that. There's not yet a safe enough way for an individual of European American descent to open that dialogue and even to comment, going back to the Justin Timberlake tweet that was in support of Jesse Williams that had him, basically attacked via Twitter from African American community members that didn't either understand what he was saying or didn't appreciate it, but we discussed it at length. That was a tweet from Justin Timberlake in support of Jesse Williams that, because of a misunderstanding and miscommunication, what I like to believe, just a completely, hot topic, polarized subject. It's just not safe yet for an individual of European American descent to say something. So it's not that, we don't want to discuss it or whatever. It's just this is the only place I'm aware of where you can have a debate. And even when we have the debate, and I'm clear enough in my mind in what I'm saying, it still gets miscommunicated to some of the readers who then feel the need to go out there and, re-educate me again. And it's just one of those things where until we can have a much broader base of people participating, it's never safe for me to volunteer that without basically knowing I'm going to be misunderstood and in many cases, schooled on, you don't understand what you're talking about, so don't talk. So the idea is we have to open the dialogue, but we've got to make it safer for everybody to speak without being attacked when they're misunderstood.
Yeah,
Sure.
let me jump in on that, because there's a couple things. One of the key concepts John raised is this idea of privilege, and I know I celebrate the idea that privilege is in common vocabulary now. Like, I can literally mark the history of that word when it comes to discussing race in the United States over the last 20 years, that in 95, 96, there was no sense of privilege. You could look at a couple scholars, mainly in the field of education, who could deal with Peggy McIntosh and Ruth Frankenberg, and they were talking about this in really narrow academic circles, that there was not just racism as discrimination, there was racism as conferring benefit or advantage, but there was no sense of that privilege. And then in the 2000 primary, in the Democratic primary, Bill Bradley from New Jersey stood on stage debating Al Gore and said, well, what are we going to do as we face racism? What are we going to do to dismantle white skin privilege? And I know I fell out of my chair when he said this in a national debate stage. 10 years later, by 2010, you have a man named Tim Wise, who I've been working with for almost 15 years. At that point, becomes a national, international celebrity as a white voice of the South who had fought against David Duke, whose life comes to embody the idea of fighting against white privilege. And even he gets blowback as a committed educator on the issue for being white and trying to talk through racial justice issues. So, John, you are far from alone, but you're in the process of doing a conversation that as you fight through the blowback, you're really doing the work that's making the society a better place for all people. And so that sacrifice reminds me of a historical book that really transformed the idea of the civil rights movement is Carter Woodson's Miseducation of the Negro. This applies not just to Africans and African Americans in the United States. There is a miseducation of the white American that's happened. And this is really what Scott has been talking about, is the lack of exposure to the conversation, that even if you get into it once a week or once a month, that step that you take in fighting through and learning. I do this constantly, not just with friends on Facebook or social media, but face-to-face with colleagues, with folks who just have never thought about asking any of the questions or even trying it. My students often come to the class talking about Quentin Tarantino's work, whether it used to be Pulp Fiction, now it's Django Unchained, and they'll say, they'll try and ask questions that are not formed perfectly or not well informed by the history, and I kind of model for them how to move from a place where that's the only exposure that they have that's fictional and problematic to a place where they can at least participate in a comfortable way, in a safe way, that they don't feel punished for not knowing better. And so from there, I would say the best model I see currently right now for anyone who struggles with entering into a conversation about white supremacy is to really take on the work of black women scholars dealing with intersectionality is probably the key word. And then at the forefront of the intersectional analysis that's out there is the work in Afrofuturism. And so I say that looking at a really well-recognized African-American writer right now is Ta-Nehisi Coates, the book that he put out that deals with kind of the pain of being a father and facing the kind of risk of continual racial violence. But really his stuff that he's doing with the Black Panther comic under the Marvel Comics imprint, which is now Disney, that's showing what does an autonomous black utopia look like from the perspective of an African-American, the person of the African diaspora. As white Americans and really people of every ethnic background start to understand the philosophy, the epistemology, the worldview of people like Coates, of stretching back Woodson, of black feminist writers, I would say Patricia Hill Collins is at the top of my list. Getting in and understanding how these folks write and describe their world. Toni Morrison, James Baldwin. The more you encounter just even segments, excerpts of the work that they've written, the more profitable and the more open the dialogue is going to become.
So I have a question, and I want to first let our listeners know the book that you're referring to by Ta-Nehisi Coates is called Between the World and Me, and it's an excellent, excellent book that I listened to, and it's a must listen to, and it resonated with me so much as a young man who grew up in West Philadelphia. It felt like he was, explaining my life story and how the world has unfolded for me. And I think, and I've met other people, a lot of European Americans who've read it as well, and it really helps them to understand how it was kind of like a coming of age tale of the trials and tribulations of growing up African American in the 80s and 90s. So with that being said, I want to ask you, Dr. Greason, but and bringing this back to economics, why should European Americans as a whole care? The average European American has 13 times more wealth than the average African American. And based on my dialogues and engaging with people, most European Americans believe that that's just because European Americans have, put themselves in a position to do that. And they don't see how, a lot of instances, they don't see how the past has anything to do with it. And most of the time they're of the, mindset of, I don't even want to talk about the past. Let's talk about what you can do right now because America is so great. So they, in a lot of instances, don't want to engage on that level. So why should they even care about doing the work that you just suggested? And economically, why should they care? Because they already have, and I'm speaking when I say they, because I like to be specific, I'm speaking about European Americans in general. They already have the seat at the head of the table across most of the industries in America that build and create wealth. So why should they care about the average African American?
There's two really pointed answers, and I can expand on both of them if you want. But I'll start with the economic one because that's the one that almost no one ever hears. This is going to be one of the main features of my main new book coming out in the next year or two. As European Americans have kind of fooled themselves into buying into having 13 times more wealth than the average black household is a sign of superiority. What I've found is, whether under slavery or segregation, that kind of wealth accumulation is actually stymied by the racial disparity that we maintain. That is, settling for the amount of wealth that the average white household has is actually frustrated, and it prevents the kind of growth, certainly within the United States, which is the wealthiest country in the world. But those barriers just greatly increase the levels of poverty and debt that white households incur to kind of maintain the barriers. Now, I could go off on the actual math and how that actually works, but the perception of stable white wealth growth over the last 200 years basically creates a misperception that wealth grows most rapidly through inequality, and that is a complete lie. And so that's one of the things I'm going to publish and kind of lay out to change the way we do our economic policy debate. Beyond that, beyond the just strict quantitative measure of you do better when folks grow multiple fountains of wealth for everybody that's possible for. Beyond that, the kind of cultural and spiritual cost is the stuff that Dr. King is so good at talking about. And then Baldwin as well, and Morrison does it amazingly through her fiction, is that there's a crippling factor for folks who participated in slave ownership or slave trade. There's a crippling factor for folks who just benefit passively from the existence of segregated institutions and neighborhoods, that there is a piece of their soul, there is a piece of their fundamental self that never develops, that never really accomplishes the kind of comfort and feeling of safety and just human peace of mind that is possible when you actually tear down the barriers of inequality. And so I think within the African American kind of activist tradition, there's a very keen sense about the spiritual and emotional and holistic cost of maintaining, injustice. Frantz Fanon is spectacular on this point, that he uses as a metaphor the way that a jailer who goes in and beats his prisoner every day to maintain discipline ultimately becomes a beast himself, that he is constantly, as he beats the prisoner, he is beating himself over a period of months and years, that eventually he has become as degraded as he intended to inflict injury and degradation on the incarcerated. And so that, I think we have a pretty good vocabulary if people want to just encounter it. What I'm trying to show is that on a smaller scale, the way that we imagine wealth and poverty is equally destructive to everybody involved.
I believe that holistically, totally, with everything in me, and I get into those debates with family and friends at times who believe that the way that our capitalistic society is set up, that we need a bottom class. We need people to kind of step on in order for
that's Marx.
Those.
I mean, that's classic Karl Marx.
Yeah, classism.
They posit that. They posit that very clearly. And I think what you move towards is systems that people describe as socialist or authoritarian communist. We've fallen into theoretical binaries that simplify our economic debate, and we don't actually look at what we can build for ourselves to maintain
Absolutely.
social and economic dignity. And if we stop getting trapped in the theoretical schools and put into practice local institution building that prioritizes ending homelessness and getting free energy to different households and making sure everyone has enough to eat, all of a sudden a new universe, a new theoretical framework emerges for us to employ.
Absolutely. I love it. I love it. And that's why I love dialogue, because one of the core tenets of dialogue is that, you bring these two opposing worldviews and you create something that's never been created before. And I recently was speaking to actually the co-founder in my tech startup about that concept when we spoke about these things. And, he was saying, it's not fair if millionaires have to, give some of their money to poor people, just kind of that polarized point of view. And my thing is, man, it's not about capitalism versus socialism. It's about creating something that's never been created before. This is a country of innovators. This is a world of innovation in the country, especially America. We pride ourselves on innovation, and yet we continue to look at, quote unquote bums that people. And I'm like, how is that even real? Like, or a concept like working poor. Those things should not exist in a country with all the resources that we have, intellectual as well as capital and financial resources. When I look at homeless people, I feel like we've done something totally wrong. And when I look at the impoverished neighborhoods, I'm like, we're doing something wrong. We are so innovative, but we can't socially innovate. And I reject those thoughts, and I believe that it's absolutely possible. And it's refreshing to hear, your sentiments and your work. And I look forward to, getting to know your work more. And ultimately, I'm saying it now, we're going to work together, in the future. And what I'd like to ask, and I know that I told you that, we only needed you for 1 hour. But I had one more question, if you have the time, that I'd like to close out with. So I want to talk to you, ask the question about reparations, because I want to say this for our listeners. Because of my pride and because of my ambition and because of my indoctrination, for a large period of my life, when I became aware of that term in my adulthood, I didn't give it any thought, because I'm one of those people who believes that I can go out and get things done and make my way because of my God-given, gifts. And so the idea of having a quote-unquote handout like reparations, I never really processed it until recently when I got into this work. And when I got into this work through RaceHaven, I had to become more open to, all the various things. When I honed in on eliminating racism and trying to make our society whole in a more harmonious America, I couldn't run from the concept of reconciliation. And in my mind, when I think about solutions, in my mind, I always come back to acknowledgement, empathy, and reconciliation. And what I call truth, not what I call, but the term out there, truth and reconciliation. And within reconciliation, you can't not think about that without thinking about reparations. So I've been reading about it more and more frequently, recently, and I want to get your thoughts on it, because now, whereas before I was of the, mindset of, we have enough structure where anyone can go out and get what they need, I now am a firm believer that some sort of reparations policies are needed if we're ever going to reconcile in this country. Not because Scott wants a handout, because my pride still says I don't need anything from anyone. But in terms of leveling the playing field and making good on the past wrongs, I feel like, some form of reparation policy is certainly needed in this country. And I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I've been a part of various coalitions to pursue reparations on multiple scales, not just within the United States. For almost 20 years. I think I started with the folks at the Black Radical Congress in 1997. And so, I have been about kind of the economic restoration that people of African descent around the world are due from multiple national governments and really all kinds of different private institutions. I've really been at the forefront in the 21st century of calling for institutions of higher education to recognize the way that slavery and the slave trade and segregation. I'm probably the number one advocate in the United States saying that segregation must be studied as an economic phenomenon and how that shaped public universities, private institutions. And so it's not just about the Congress adopting a reparations resolution. It's not just about state legislatures like we've had in Florida and Oklahoma taking on the process of truth and reconciliation. I think North Carolina has done it as well. All of that needs to happen in a more coordinated, less haphazard fashion. And that's what I press for constantly. At the other side of it, though, the thing that kind of sets me apart from some really amazing advocates, the folks with Trans-Africa, Bill Fletcher, Randall Robinson's kind of approach to the topic, is that they try to give a set number and then decide how they're going to pursue this. Cornel West and Travis Smiley have taken on similar kinds of discussions. For me, what strikes me about a post like you put up, I think it was in the RaceHaven group, about the kinds of reparation that have been granted in different historical contexts, is that almost always it's a product of people who already have some degree of economic self-sufficiency, that they don't necessarily need the reparations, but they have the force of economic strength to then compel a local, a state, or an international body to then give an additional kind of symbolic gift of reparations to say, yes, this was wrong, yes, this was terrible, and here we want to apologize and demonstrate our willingness to support your continued growth over a period of time. And I think particularly some of the folks affected by the European Holocaust, and particularly Jewish folks who were killed or displaced through that genocide, also the way that the Japanese Americans were interned, that they all kind of leveraged an economic strength beyond the institution that they gained the concession from. And it seems kind of counterintuitive that folks who are struggling with poverty really need some kind of institutional action to then reverse the fortune. The way it seems to work, as I've looked at it, is that once you've already begun the change and kind of reverse the economic problems, is when you can go back and then politically press for the kind of concession that traditionally reparations call for. And so this leads to, I think, the article you posted yesterday that I wrote for the BK Nation folks, where I want folks to start to think more globally about social justice, whether it's labor unions or trade organizations, any of the kind of traditional foundations, the Catholic Church, the Black church movement. Any social justice network needs to think about the kind of goals they want to implement over a year or 3 years or 5 years on a global scale. And so what I've been doing the last couple of years is pressing for a system, an organized system of economic labor mobility that essentially people can leverage and get access to more work and more pay, greater wages, by migrating for parts of the year. We already do this in a very disorganized fashion that generally suppresses wages in a lot of the world's economies. But there's an enormous vacuum, coalition of national and international groups to come together and actually help people who are struggling move from place to place over the course of a year. And it doesn't have to be family movement. You can actually keep a family in a relatively small economy living well, but give the wage earners within the family, men or women, multiple wage earners in many contexts, the ability to travel internationally so they can get better wages, better work experience, more skills. And it even helps grow new, stable, cooperative enterprise that makes those kinds of families and communities really better protected than we've ever seen in the history of the world. And so for me, a step towards reparations is to get the kind of capital conservatively represented by, just in the African diaspora, the labor market is going to be on the scale of $2 to $3 trillion over the course of a decade. We leverage that to then generate an additional $5, 10, $15 trillion in new investment and infrastructure to protect low-income families. I mean, I'm dealing with folks outside the city in Jackson, Mississippi that don't have running water or access to stable electrical grids. Like, we could change their lives in the space of a year and a half with that kind of network. And so that's the kind of thing that I'm looking for to press for reparations, is stronger global infrastructure in the interest of working families. And with that, we could then turn that into stronger financial capital. Organized 2 billion, 3 billion people can be met over the next decade.
Interesting. Yes, and that was a very, very interesting article, and a good article. And quite frankly, I've never read anything about that before in the way that you wrote it or the concept. And What I appreciate about reading your articles and your work is that it's all solutions focused. And that's the theme of Race Haven, is that, it's solutions focused dialogue. And you don't just, tell what's happening. What's interesting about you and your work, you not only bring the historical perspective, but you also have implemented actual solutions oriented suggestions and policies, and as well as, theories and concepts. So thank you. Thank you for contributing to society in that way. And, it's interesting because you again, it's amazing. And man, it's another, we can go on and on and on about some of the questions I have in my mind. I've had to hold back some of the questions I have, but it just frustrates me because the work of people like yourself and so many other historians and sociologists and psychologists and and just other academics out there who are doing the work, who have, access to answers and suggestions, but yet when you turn on the news, people are saying, well, what's the solution? Or when you go to social media, and for me, I don't even watch the news. I watch sports. Like, that's the only thing I watch. And even now, this is, social issues have now become a part of the sports, world, which is a good thing in my opinion. But I get my news that way, like either on Facebook or through, the sports shows that I watch and the commentary that now, they talk about the social issues because athletes are getting involved. So with that being said, it's always like, well, what's the solution? Well, or what you read on social media, people want to say, but there's no one's doing anything. You hear all this talk, but no one's doing anything. But yet we get on a show like this and I speak to you and here's 20 years of you doing things. So it just boggles my mind. Or Dr. Joy DeGraw, who talks about, or I don't know if I said her name right, DeGroy, who has the post-traumatic slave syndrome research. When people say, well, I don't know why, African Americans are, let's say it like this, poor, young, traumatized African Americans who are victims of generational poverty are killing each other at such a high disproportionate rate. When people want to say, I don't know why, I'm like, well, read or listen to Dr. Joy DeGroy's work. The 12 years of research went into post-traumatic slave syndrome. And I can go on. And it frustrates me that individuals like yourself and her and so many others don't have a greater voice in society. So,
you're helping. You're helping. Doing shows like this makes a substantial impact. So keep up the work, and I'm always available, man. You got other things we want to come back and do, just let me know. And, you mentioned Dr. Joy's work. There's a great article at the African American Intellectual History Society that talks a great deal about that. And so I'll send you guys the links, post them up on Race Haven. But you definitely want to check out, the acronym is AAIHS. If you punch that into Google, you'll get the entire archive. They're doing some amazing work to kind of provide more solutions, more knowledge to help us deal with the crisis that we're in.
Absolutely. Thank you for that resource. John, do you have anything you'd like to add or ask before we close out?
No, I just want to say thank you because it really has been a tremendously influential and educational hour. And I wish we were going to be able to spend more time. I'll throw out there, as Scott just mentioned, anytime you'd like to be back. I enjoy listening to you, and we'll be doing a lot more reading on the information that you've shared with us.
Can't wait to work with you guys more. Thank you again so much.
Thank you so much for being a part of this.
Well, that's our time for today. So, again, I want to say just a special thank you to both my co-host, John Costino, and our guest, Dr. Walter Greason. And before I let you go, Dr. Greason, I just want to ask you to let our listeners know how they can reach out to you and your work and learn more about your work. What's the best way to connect with you?
I would say right now, social media generally is multiple platforms. So I have a new Instagram is at DUBDEEGEEWDG, my initials. Or you can find me on Twitter. This is another really good platform. I put out a lot of stuff. It's at World Professor, WORLDPROFESSOR, World Professor. I'm on LinkedIn under my regular name, Walter Greason. You can catch me on Facebook. I have a number of book pages where I do classroom discussions on almost a daily basis. But yeah, any of those 4 spots on social media, you can catch me right away. And they all have my email address, and a couple of them have my office telephone number, so you'll always be able to catch me whatever way is most convenient.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much. And we appreciate your time, and we will certainly have you on again in the future. So to close out the show, I want to, let's see here. Give me a second here. All right. So I want to say to our listeners to please be sure to subscribe to the Race Haven podcast on the iPhone podcast app or Stitcher Radio app for Android so that you never miss the dialogue or a special interview like we were able to conduct today. And if you love this show, please leave us a review on the podcast and Stitcher apps. This will help our show gain more visibility and help us to gain more listeners. Also, John and I want to hear from you. We want to hear from you about today's show or any show or any message you want us to get to Dr. Greason, who is our guest today. You can send that to the email address solutions@RaceHavenPodcast.com, and we will have a chance to read. Every once in a while, we may get a chance to read some of your perspectives or your questions on the show. Please visit the Race Haven Podcast Facebook page or RaceHavenPodcast.com and leave comments and questions about today's show. You can also join our online community by joining the Race Haven Community Dialogue Facebook group. If today's episode resonated with you, please share it with your friends on social media, email, text message, however you share things. Please get the word out. A Race Haven is a safe place for people from diverse ethnic, religious, cultural, and political backgrounds to bring their race-based perspectives, questions, assumptions, frustrations, and experiences to engage in thoughtful, honest dialogue in an effort to transcend race and unify America. Remember, we are all smarter when we think together. Peace.
Thanks for listening to the Race Haven Radio Show and Podcast. Be sure to visit www.racehavenblog.com to comment and learn more.
Be the hero at home when you order Carrabba's Italian Grill with delivery or carside carryout located in the shops at Cumberland. Feed up to 5 starting at $7 per person with Carrabba's family bundles. Delivery begins after 4 p.m. and curbside takeaways available for lunch and dinner. Order online at carrabbas.com/delivery and get made-from-scratch Italian tonight. Be the hero at home when you order Outback Steakhouse with delivery or curbside takeaway located at Clark Crossing in Athens. Delivery begins after 4 p.m. and curbside takeaway is available for lunch and dinner. Order online at outback.com/delivery and get all your favorites tonight.